Hi there. We're going to be looking at these issues of culture and capitalism and media technology and talking about three essays here, two of which are classics and one of which is by me. um, the, uh, the first two essays here, Walter Benjamin's The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, is a very highly influential classic essay that has influenced a lot of media studies and just had a very widespread influence throughout the humanities on issues of media technology and art and culture. And then the second essay, Theodor Adorno's work on popular music, is sort of part of his larger critique of what we call the culture industry. And this is an especially short but very clear critique from Adorno's very curmudgeonly perspective about popular music. And then after I've talked about those two, I will briefly talk about my own essay written back in 2012 that tried to bring Benjamin and Adorno's ideas and the sort of like the debate between them into something that I applied to the history of popular music in the decades long after they were writing. So with Benjamin and Adorno, they take us into a group of scholars that are generally known as the Frankfurt School, who were a group of scholars affiliated with the Institute for Social Research, established back in 1923. And they basically were an interdisciplinary group of intellectuals who combined, they all had like different strengths in terms of philosophy, political economy, social science, aesthetics, and cultural criticism, art criticism, music criticism, and so forth. And so that the whole idea was that, they would have this kind of interdisciplinary mixture of strengths and interests and not to be, specialized or pigeonholed as academia was then and still is to this day. Intellectually, this is a group that was especially influenced by Marxism, but was also very eclectic in terms of taking other influences. Some were influenced by Freudian psychoanalysis, which was a relatively new thing at the time, and also with the sociology of Max Weber, particularly Max Weber's analysis of rationalization and bureaucracy and instrumental rationality. After, in terms of the biography of this school, as predominantly Jewish German scholars who were highly influenced by Marxism, as you can imagine, they were kind of, public enemy number one under Hitler and Nazi Germany. So, once Hitler took power in 1933, this group of scholars was basically forced to flee Nazi Germany. And many of them took exile in the United States, in New York City, and in Los Angeles. Others were not so fortunate, as we'll see with Walter Benjamin. He committed suicide, fleeing the Nazis, and committed suicide right before he basically thought he was going to get caught. So as a school, or as a group of scholars, the intellectual questions that are raised by the Frankfurt School have to do with a critique of science, technology, and rationality, and their connection with capitalism. So rather than seeing, science and technology as a beacon of progress and enlightenment, they saw that, modern societies in the 20th century were descending into what they described as barbarism, as, the antithesis of civilization, as, authoritarian societies defined by domination and repression. In this respect, the key text is by Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, a text called The Dialectic of Enlightenment that is written during their years in Los Angeles. But it was many Frankfurt School scholars shared this kind of pessimism in the face of incredibly dark times of, Nazism and the Holocaust and everything else surrounding those times of the 1930s and 40s. So they had their eyes focused on what they called the totally administered societies that were based on calculability and technological control, in which the freedom of individuals had been basically squashed and squeezed out. And here again is where, they kind of take Marx's critique of capitalism along with Weber's critique of instrumental rationality and bureaucracy, and fuse them into this theory of the totally administered society. And for them, the Frankfurt School, this description applied both to Western capitalist societies and to Eastern communist societies in the context of, the 1940s and 1950s. But even going back further, there had been this growing disillusionment on these these intellectuals who otherwise identified as Marxists and were clearly influenced by Marx, but sought to distance themselves in the 1920s and 30s from the Soviet Union and from Stalinism, as they, saw the damage, the destruction, the murder that was taking place in the Soviet Union, and the way that it was, basically betraying the original revolutionary ideas of Russia, of revolutionary Russia. So they were not alone in this sense. There was a sort of a loose group of intellectuals who had sought a kind of an alternative within Marxism, an alternative to what they saw as a very dogmatic and deterministic form of Marxism that had, become the orthodoxy of state propaganda in the Soviet Union. And so this group of scholars would later, become to be known as like Western Marxists, in the way that they were distinct from the official orthodoxy of the Soviet Union and the other existing socialist states of Eastern Europe. Now, Benjamin and Adorno were, in differing ways, part of this Frankfurt School. Adorno was more officially a member and a central part of the Frankfurt School's development. Benjamin was more peripheral, certainly somebody who had influenced a lot of folks, but was not really officially integrated into academia and the university system in the same way that Adorno and Max Horkheimer and others were. And so Benjamin and Adorno, they were friends, and they had met, a number of years previously, in the 1920s. And Benjamin was a little bit older, and Adorno was really taken with him and influenced him by him. But nonetheless, they had substantial differences. And in their correspondence over the years in the 1920s and especially in the 1930s, they carried on this long running debate. And it was a debate about a lot of different topics but for our purposes, the one that will be especially important is a long running debate about the media, about popular culture, and about what Adorno called the culture industry. Generally speaking, Benjamin drew more optimistic conclusions, particularly when looking at media technologies that allowed culture and art to be reproduced. He believed that these media technologies could have a more democratizing kind of impact that allowed people to be participants and producers of culture and art, and not just spectators and consumers. Adorno, on the other hand, saw the culture industry, what he called the culture industry, what he and Max Horkheimer called the culture industry, as a really manipulative force that pacified and manipulated its audiences into being, kind of dupes into a life of consumerism and conformity. So they did share some similarities of opinion. Adorno agreed with Benjamin that what Benjamin had called the aura of art was decaying in modern societies as a result of these media technologies. But the culture industry, Adorno countered, was also creating its own kind of, like substitute, or what he called a foggy mist that was more in the form of like a commodity fetish, as opposed to the original kind of aura that had been attached to art. So we'll look at these issues in a little bit more detail now as we get into their respective essays. So starting with Walter Benjamin, to say a little bit more about this person. He was a philosopher and cultural critic who drew from a wide range of different intellectual and artistic movements of his time, who had a wide range of interests in literature, art, theater, film, photography, and so forth. And also intellectually drew not only from Marxism, but from the traditions of German Romanticism, and Jewish mysticism was especially important. He carried on a lot ongoing correspondence with some of the most important Jewish theological thinkers of his time. And he's profoundly interested in, especially in questions of redemption and the things of that matter. So Benjamin ultimately, his life came to a very tragic end in 1940. As I mentioned, he stayed in Europe longer than the other members of the Frankfurt School, like Adorno, who left pretty immediately after Hitler took power. Benjamin stayed around mostly in Paris through the 1930s. And then, with the Nazi occupations and invasions into Western Europe, he recognized that it was time to get the fuck out of Dodge, and basically got as far as Spain. And he and the party that he was with, feared that he was going to be caught. And so he took like enough morphine to basically kill a horse, and died by suicide that way. The essay that we're looking at here in 1936 is one that starts off with acknowledging a central point that's made by Karl Marx in, basically throughout Marx's work, which is that capitalism is this fundamentally contradictory system. And it's a system that, as Marx says, creates its own gravediggers. In other words, it's a system that creates the contradictions that make it possible to abolish capitalism itself. So in this in this opening paragraph of the essay, what Benjamin is doing is kind of setting up this idea that he's going to be looking at the contradictions of capitalism as they are manifest, in this particular case, in media technologies and the consequences of what he calls mechanical reproduction. So whereas Marx was writing at capitalism, about capitalism in this, Benjamin calls it this state of infancy. Its early state in the 19th century. Benjamin is now suggesting, writing from his perspective in the 20th century, that things have reached a higher level and the contradictions have become more intense. And in particular, he will locate the source of these contradictions in media technologies. From there, in this sort of opening part of the essay, basically, like, in the second paragraph of the preface, he starts talking about culture in terms of this, what Marx had originally called a relationship between the base and the superstructure. And Marx had talked about this going back to his writings from 1859, whereby the base referred to the mode of production, kind of like the material foundation of society, the economic system that shapes all the other institutions, the so-called superstructure, that arise on top of this foundation. So that would be like the political system, the legal system, culture, all of these social institutions. The base superstructure metaphor is meant to understand how it is that the economy, how it is that the mode of production shapes or determines all of these other kinds of institutions in society, the political system, the legal system, the cultural system, and so forth. There's this long-standing, ongoing debate within Marxism, among Marxists, about the base superstructure model, like, how strongly does the economic system determine these other institutions? Is there a reciprocal impact in which, like, politics and culture and the law, the legal system can impact the mode of production, the economic system, in a reciprocal way? I don't have time to get into all of that kind of debate. I'm just trying to get you some context for understanding this preface, that where Benjamin is basically setting up what he's going to say in terms of a Marxist paradigm of the relationship between culture and the mode of production. And he's setting up that there may be some kinds of contradictions. He also notes here in this preface that there may be a kind of lag in which changes that take place in the mode of production may be much faster than the changes that take place in culture. Basically, in other words, that culture lags behind the changes that are taking place in the economic system, in the mode of production, and in technology, which, as we know, in the 21st century, changed very, very quickly. And so, culture may be a little bit slower to catch up to these economic and technological changes. So in section 1, he starts by talking about the technological changes that have enabled reproduction of works of art. And so he goes, all the way back to lithography and talks about like the printing press, and then, brings things more into, the late 19th century and 20th century with photography and film. And then the advent of reproducing recorded sound, like recordings. So all of these forms of reproduction, these technologies of reproduction have represent something new. Basically, he says, like, historically, like, the work of art has always been, reproducible in terms of you can make like imitations and replicas, but these technologies, these media technologies especially photography, film, and recorded sound, this represents something new and something qualitatively different, according to Benjamin. So he's wanting to focus in on these media technologies of reproduction. So then section 2, he begins with this notion of what he calls the aura of an artwork. And aura will be a really important concept for Benjamin. I kind of hinted at it a little bit earlier. But here in section 2, he kind of defines aura in terms of singularity. So that something has an aura when it has a unique presence in time and space. So its notion of aura is basically connected with the fact that there's only one of them. So like, the Mona Lisa, as pictured here, people fly from all over the world to come and see the one and only Mona Lisa, even though they could just like Google it, or like look it up in in a textbook, or they could buy a print at an art store. But the original, the singular, the thing that has a unique presence in time and space, according to Benjamin, radiates this sort of aura, this kind of like, this kind of singularity of originality. But what technological reproduction does is it sort of spells the death of that kind of aura, of that kind of authenticity. The aura of the artwork begins to wither away, as Benjamin says. It becomes detached from the domain of tradition. So now let's just kind of like hold this thought for a minute, because it sounds like Benjamin is kind of like lamenting something like these. Maybe he's sad about the passing of aura. He thinks maybe that this is kind of a bad thing, and he's maybe like nostalgic for the days when art had aura, and now he's like kind of depressed that it doesn't. This is not in fact the case. Benjamin will sort of twist our assumptions here in the next couple of sections to point out what he thinks are actually some liberating or democratizing impacts of these media technologies of reproduction, in a way that will kind of like fuck with our assumptions a little bit, and also that will expose what we were saying earlier about the contradictions, the fundamentally contradictory nature of contemporary capitalism. So here he's saying that what reproduction, what these forms of media technology that allow us to reproduce artworks, what they do is they create a plurality of copies that meet the beholder or the listener in his or her own particular situation. So he is beginning to suggest here that this aura, this loss of aura, may not be such a terrible thing after all. That, or at least he's beginning to suggest here that maybe it has its positive side, in the sense that art and culture will become more accessible, more democratic. That these technologies of reproduction also open up new ways for people to experience and receive art. So maybe it's not such a horrible thing. So far, Benjamin is basically suggesting here that this will allow people, these technologies, kind of change people's perception. They change people's um, ways of engaging with art, and they change like the whole function, like the whole purpose of what art is, in ways that he believes will enable greater participation and actually less passivity, less spectatorship among audiences. So in section 3, he adds on a little bit to his definition of aura in terms of talking about it as a phenomenon of distance. So, we have not only the sense that it's singular, it has to do with singularity and originality, the unique presence in time and space, but also that this aura conveys a kind of distance, a sense of being in the presence of something greater than ourselves, a kind of an awe. And here his examples have more to do with a sense of awe that we might feel in the presence of natural beauty, in the presence of a mountain range, for example, right? So this kind of sense of being in the presence of something that radiates, that it is, greater than us, again, that radiates just this, this kind of like, this sense of something bigger than us. And what he's saying the technologies of reproduction do is in some ways they kind of reduce that distance. They bring art closer to the masses. Maybe I didn't pick exactly the best picture to represent the positive side of this, because it looks like an absolute nightmare in this picture of all these people, in this slide of all these people trying to get a picture of the Mona Lisa on their digital cameras, or their phones or whatever. And so, I mean, perhaps in retrospect, a different slide would work better to convey the positive, or the more optimistic conclusions that Benjamin is trying to draw here. He's saying, that this destruction of the aura is not necessarily a bad thing. These kinds of the way that these media technologies enable us to close the distance between ourselves and the work of art. In section 4, he will elaborate a little bit more on why this is. We'll get a better sense of the why, Benjamin's more kind of like dialectical vision of how this might be kind of a positive development. So section 4 considers how the unique presence of an artwork was originally based on its connection with tradition, its function in rituals that were initially magical and then became more filtered into like religion. And so basically saying like that kind of that aura, that sense of distance, that singularity of art, it all originally goes back to religion, and then before that even into this realm of like magic. This is what he calls the ritual function of aura. That kind of that sense comes from initially from religion, and before that from this kind of magic. That's where this sense of what makes the artwork authentic and therefore sacred. This is the what was the function of art in pre-modern cultures was connected to to art, to magic, and to religion. So at the end of section 4, he's basically saying that, like, now what technologies of reproduction have done is it's changed the whole, like, function of what art is supposed to do in the first place. He says mechanical reproduction emancipates the work of art from its parasitical dependence on ritual. So this former connection that that art had with with religion and with magic has been severed. The loss of aura is the final shedding of this original connection, this pre-modern connection with magic and religion, in which had exercised all of this power over people, this sort of distance, this sense that people were in the presence of something that was bigger than them, that had power over them. And in the age of mechanical reproduction, what has kind of done is brought art back to the level of people. Audiences can be more engaged. Ordinary people can produce and reproduce their own forms of media. As Benjamin says, the distinction between the author and the public is about to lose its basic character. In other words, people become both like producers and consumers. They become not just like spectators, but also authors, So this kind of leveling of art actually makes it more democratic and more accessible. So Benjamin imagined that actually this could make possible a kind of a revolutionary cultural politics. He was influenced by a number of artistic and cultural movements of his time, in the 1920s and 30s. Everything from the epic theater of Bertolt Brecht, who was another friend of his and somebody who he carried on a lifelong correspondence with, but also the artistic movements like Dadaism and Surrealism and the Soviet constructivists had, these various techniques of, using juxtaposition and recombination and found objects and montage and these kinds of techniques that Benjamin thought were, kind of the could be used in a very revolutionary kind of cultural politics. At the same time, in the 1930s especially, he's beginning to recognize the way in which art could be used for fascistic purposes, that there is this movement towards fascist art, especially in the movement known as the Italian Futurists, these artists under Mussolini's Italy, who kind of glamorized war, and they glamorized technology, and they glamorized sort of the speed of modernity. And so Benjamin concludes that we're basically in a new era now, in the 20th century, where art and culture means something different, and there's a different kind of struggle that's taking place over them, whereby, as he says, the instant the criterion of authenticity ceases to be applicable to artistic production, the whole social function of art is revolutionized. Instead of being based on ritual, it begins to be based on another practice, politics. Right? So the whole social function of art has been revolutionized. It's been disconnected from this previous function that, that was connected with ritual and magic and religion. And, rather than, lament that and cry about it and be nostalgic, Benjamin thinks that, we need to kind of face up to this situation and recognize the opportunities and possibilities. So instead of being based on ritual, art is now based on another practice, the practice of politics. And so it is subject to social struggles. And Benjamin believes that this, struggle between fascistic forms of art and, revolutionary kinds of socialist or surrealist or Dadaist art that draws inspiration from Marxism, that this was kind of the future in which art would have this this political role within social struggles. Now, his friend and also intellectual rival Theodor Adorno, I just think this picture kind of says it all about Adorno. He's in some ways just just a hater, but a really great and brilliant hater, who's just like based a whole kind of politics and aesthetics and philosophy around negation, around no, and so Adorno is an impossibly complex and fascinating figure. We're just going to look here at some of his writings about popular music and what he called the culture industry. Suffice it to say, he absolutely hated popular music of his time. Even as you see, he wrote here in 1936 an essay about jazz. And it's not clear exactly what kind of jazz Adorno had heard or what he was listening to. It was probably more like kind of the commercialized kinds of jazz that he might have heard on the radio or something. But he really, thought that even jazz was pretty terrible, repetitive, conformist music. The essay that we'll look at here on popular music in 1941 kind of encapsulates a lot of his, basically pessimism and unrelenting criticism of popular music and its connection to what he would later call the culture industry. So the culture industry were basically all of these businesses and corporations, whether they were the Hollywood movie industry or Disney or NBC or RCA, these broadcasting companies or record companies, basically like a whole industry that was out to make money on culture. And so Adorno started setting his sights on them in the 1940s, along with Max Horkheimer in their book on the dialectic of enlightenment, and then came back to this topic in the early 1960s, basically with no apologies. Like the culture industry was reconsidered in this essay, but he more or less drew the same kinds of conclusions, even writing 20 years later. So in this essay on popular music, Adorno begins by talking about what he sees as the defining characteristics of popular music, in contrast to what he called serious music, or what we would today might call classical music, but also like modern music, Schoenberg or that kind of like art music, like modern art music. So popular music, what Adorno, sort of hated on here in this essay, were defined by standardization and pseudo-individualization. Standardization being the way that basically there was this kind of formulaic mass production of hit songs, this like an assembly line of hits, which, to Adorno's ears at least, all those songs sounded alike. And the reason that they sounded alike, according to Adorno, was because of the economic imperative behind them. So that one popular song scored a great success, and then hundreds of others sprang up immediately to imitate that successful one. So there's just an economic compulsion here to maximize profitability based on imitating what has been successful before, and also minimizing risk in that sense. So you don't want to take a risk on things that haven't been successful previously. You want to imitate the things that you already know people like. And so that's why we get sequels of movies and songs that all sound the same, and movies that all have basically the same plot and things like that. This is what Adorno calls standardization. And the standardization is the result of what he calls large-scale economic concentration in the music industry. The fact that the music industry was dominated by a handful of corporations, and that the radio broadcasting was dominated by a handful of corporate broadcasters. This was, for Adorno, the reason why it is that we have this really standardized form of culture and media. And he said, basically, like, the attempts to make popular culture individualized or seem individualized were just kind of pseudo, like they were just kind of like fake forms of individualization, pseudo individualization. So here he says, well, the music industry can't put out exactly the same thing over and over again. So they have to manufacture these like superficial differences between otherwise standardized products, so that songs that are, have only superficial differences between them, or stars that, have, only, are basically the same, but with some slight variation. Adorno says this is basically fools people into thinking that they have a sense of, free choice, that they have, a sense of individual taste, and it keeps consumers from grasping that what they listen to is already listened to for them, pre-digested. So Adorno's idea is basically people are kind of like being manipulated without necessarily realizing it, and they're kind of the superficial differences between these otherwise standardized products allow them to tell themselves that they are choosing these things out of their own free choice, and out of their own particular individual tastes. So Adorno is basically kind of extending a kind of a Marxist argument to talk about how popular music is colonizing people's leisure time. In other words, Marx had talked about how people's, work time had obviously been commodified and colonized. But now Adorno is saying that even when people are not at work, their leisure time has now become something that capitalists have learned to exploit and take advantage of, so that workers become alienated and bored, not only in their work lives, but experience the same kind of alienation in their leisure time, in their consumer lives. And so, they work maybe 9 to 5 at really boring, leisurely not leisurely jobs, boring, alienating jobs. And the last thing they want to do in their leisure time is like, listen to Beethoven or, like listen to something that like demands, really close attention. What they want to listen to are things that are distracting and that do not demand, that kind of close attention that Adorno associates with serious music. And, you know, likewise, we could extend the argument into, you know, what kinds of movies people want to see, or what kinds of, you know, television they would later want to kind of see. They want to do things that, you know, Adorno was saying, basically like kind of relieve them of the alienation that they experience. Whereas serious music and serious culture and serious art, in Adorno's view, demands something that is, you know, demands concentration, it demands a, you know, a conscious experience. But under capitalism, this becomes only available to a privileged elite. Um, it's not, according to Adorno at least, not something that's available to our workers who are so alienated that they want relief from boredom and effort simultaneously. So, you know, Adorno is kind of like, I mean, he's undoubtedly a cultural snob in this regard, but he's at least the kind of cultural snob who wants everybody to have a chance to experience what he thinks is, you know, really serious, uplifting culture. And he's saying that, you know, it's an unfortunate result of class society that experience is only available to a privileged elite who have the time and who are not so exhausted by their day-to-day jobs that they can, you know, concentrate and absorb and study what Adorno believes is like, you know, culture and art that is really uplifting to people. Then he talks about a concept he calls social cement, where Adorno is describing like the function of popular music in terms of perpetuating conformity, or what he calls authoritarian collectivism. So here he's talking about popular music, but it could, again, the argument could be extended to other kinds of media as well. He believed that basically there were two kinds of pop music fans. On the one hand, there were the folks that he calls rhythmically obedient. So, you know, I think he means kind of like young people who would go out dancing on Saturday night. He calls them the so-called radio generation. It's just like, you know, come on, ease up, grandpa. Like, you know, like, ease up on the so-called radio generation. In other essays, he kind of goes off on the kids who at that time were called jitterbugs, you know, in the 1940s, who would go out, you know, dancing to swing music. And then the other set of folks he talks about are the emotional types. And here I think he probably clearly means like young women, like teenage girls, but he doesn't necessarily kind of gender it directly, but uses all kinds of, you know, sort of gender stereotypes about, you know, these are listeners who look to music to obtain pleasure from emotional or erotic music. And he believes that the thing that the rhythmically obedient and the emotional have in common is that they both form this kind of social cement. You know, they are two sides of this authoritarian conformity. And so, you know, he has this line where he says, it is catharsis for the masses, but catharsis which keeps them more firmly in line. You know, so like literally cement, in the sense that it keeps people in their place, keeps them from rebelling and thinking critically for themselves, as Adorno would like them to do. This is a picture, by the way, of Adorno in a bathing suit in Los Angeles, I think somewhere maybe in Santa Monica. They lived in Santa Monica for a little while. in the 1940s, so Adorno, when he's living in LA, expands his critique of popular music into this larger, far-reaching analysis of the culture industry. Right. So Adorno's starting point was always with music. He took music very seriously. He was himself at one point an aspiring like composer, and really, thought that music was, not just artistically, but socially and politically very significant. And so for him to hear this music on the radio that he thought was really, crappy and standardized, to him, was really an affront. Not only on an artistic, but on a social and political level. So he basically expands this critique in the 1940s into a critique of this larger culture industry that includes all kinds of media and entertainment and leisure and, Hollywood and Disney and all this kind of stuff. And this is, the classic essay here is called The Culture Industry, Enlightenment as Mass Deception, from their book, The Dialectic of Enlightenment. And again, this is, especially this idea of like social cement. The idea is that, the culture industry is the thing that's going to allow, totalitarian, authoritarian forms of state capitalism to just continue to reproduce themselves indefinitely. So culture becomes basically, according to this culture industry critique, an industry like any other. It's an industry in the sense that it's dominated by capitalists who are solely interested in profit. And it extends the experience of alienation and commodification from people's work lives into their leisure time. The culture industry is defined by this process of standardization, in which, as we said with popular music, corporations are seeking to minimize risk and maximize profit. So they're drawn to formulas and genres that have been successful in the past, or at least in the recent past. Although the culture industry promotes its products as new and different, the processes of standardization create what Horkheimer and Adorno call an eternal sameness. Basically, just like same as it ever was, same as it ever was. It's just like the same shit all over and over again, but packaged in this kind of like, new and improved, kind of way with like slick marketing techniques that basically pseudo individualize these otherwise mass-produced products. The star system of celebrity was also something that Horkheimer and Adorno thought was standardized and pseudo-individualized. You basically have all these celebrities that, look and think more or less the same, with these kinds of superficial differences. And so the conclusion, again, that Adorno draws relative to Benjamin, obviously, is much more pessimistic. But he says, yeah, that aura is also disappearing, as Benjamin, had thought it was. They could agree about that. But Adorno believed that, and Horkheimer also, that the culture industry was creating this kind of substitute, this fake kind of, aura, this foggy mist. Right. So like what Benjamin had thought was that, people were now going to be kind of liberated from, like especially religion and this kind of aura and this distance that had, had this exercised all this power over people for centuries. And Adorno basically says like, yeah, not so fast. Just because people don't, just because the aura of artwork has been broken, just because its spell has been broken, and it doesn't exercise the same kind of religious power over people that it did in previous century, doesn't mean that people aren't still walking around in a cloud of illusions and kind of magical mysticism. It's just that mysticism, that kind of pseudo-religious magic, is now taken form in commodities. We now just kind of like worship commodities and money in the same way that people had previously worshipped gods. So in along with standardization, the other impact of the culture industry that Horkheimer and Adorno look to is again its impact in terms of social cement or conformity. So the idea here is that this formulaic, standardized, generic process of the culture industry encourages what they call the stunting of the consumer's powers of imagination and spontaneity. So like our ability to think critically, our ability to think creatively is kind of stunted by the fact that we are bombarded by this culture industry that is continually kind of seducing us and manipulating us, but also distracting us, concealing from us the realities of exploitation. The messages of the culture industry, basically, according to Horkheimer and Adorno, continually broadcast this message of conformity, of just like, you shall conform, you shall consume, you shall buy the new and improved. Adorno assumes that culture industry, therefore, has tremendous power over its audience. And now, to kind of be fair, I mean, I've kind of, been kind of snarky about Adorno and his assumptions about the ability to manipulate people, but you kind of have to like put yourself in his shoes too, as somebody who like grew up like being a target of Nazi propaganda and saw the ways that the Nazis were able to manipulate all kinds of people, through their, radio broadcasts and their mass rallies and their propaganda films. There was all kinds of ways in which the Nazis had, really obviously manipulated people and played into their fear and their paranoia and their, conspiracy, what we today would call conspiracy theories. And then he flees Nazi Germany only to come to America and eventually winds up in LA, in the 40s. He's like surrounded by Hollywood and Disney and, all these big corporations that are churning out advertising and, popular music and stuff. And he believes that this is like an extension, that this is the way in which people will be continually subjected to this kind of like propaganda, so that, the power of the culture industry's ideology is such that conformity has replaced consciousness, that people are no longer able to think critically and are able to be, in fact, manipulated through all of these kinds of forms of propaganda. So he believes that the age of the autonomous, independent individual is kind of over, and that people, he feels like, I think Adorno felt like he had seen enough in his lifetime to safely conclude that people could very well be manipulated by these powerful forms of media technology. Now, what I do in in my not so classic essay, um, but still published. And some people have read it. I don't mean to be so self-disparaging. What I basically try to do in this essay is apply these ideas from Benjamin and Adorno into a discussion of popular music, into an analysis of like the history of popular music. And I basically argue that Benjamin and Adorno, represent two sides of an enduring contradiction that is embedded within mass media and popular culture at large, and that I look at specifically with regard to popular music, and that this is something that has been ongoing, long after they had their exchange in the 1930s. This is something that is, I would say, even more intense as a contradiction today than it was, 80 years ago or so when Benjamin and Adorno were first writing about these things. So the digitalization of media, or this idea of digital reproduction, has made media, as we all know, has made content instantly reproducible and exchangeable and shareable, and something that we can fly around, that can fly around the world at the click of a mouse. Something that where that beyond the wildest dreams of Walter Benjamin in terms of the reproducibility of all forms of media, and the way that it like literally puts everything at our fingertips. So like most, however, there's this contradiction that I try to emphasize in this essay is between, on the one hand, this kind of accessibility that we all have to media and cultural content as a result of technology, but on the other hand, this question of, or this issue of the culture industry, in terms of how most popular culture is owned by a shrinking number of global media conglomerates. So we have, on the one hand, technologies that are making things more accessible, but on the other hand, a system of private ownership in which a handful of global media conglomerates exercise, basically a kind of an oligopoly, not necessarily a monopoly, but like a handful of people that, or a handful of corporations that control most of the market. So this contradiction between technological reproduction and the culture industry is analyzed here in this essay as being analogous to what Marx had originally identified as a central contradiction of capitalism. And that is the contradiction, as Marx called it, between the forces of production and the relations of production. I'm not going to describe this in full, but just to give you some context for this, when he talked about the forces of production, Marx meant the development of like productive forces in the sense of technology, technique, skill, know-how, just the cumulative development from generation to generation of these productive forces of technologies, but also like knowing how to do things that allow people to produce, more and more, generation to generation. And then on the other hand are the questions of the relations of production, which are the questions of like who owns what, who owns the means of production, who owns the tools, the land, the factories. These were the questions of ownership, and also the questions of labor, of who has to work for whom. And Marx's idea is that there's this fundamental contradiction between forces of production and relations of production. And under capitalism, the forces of production continue to grow and develop, but they are to some extent fettered by or held back by the relations of production. So the way in which I applied this, in this particular essay is to say, as I quote myself here, which is kind of weird, but in sum, while the productive forces of digital media create possibilities for socialization and democratization, the social relations of the global media conglomerates tend towards further privatization and centralization. So when Marx looked at the contradiction between productive forces and relations of production, he said, well, basically, like, the productive forces are growing to such an extent that it becomes possible for people to meet people's needs, to live without scarcity. Like, human beings are able to live for the first time, in world history, where they can get their needs met because the productive forces have developed to such an extent. We have the technology and the infrastructure and the know-how to be able to meet people's needs. But on the other hand, we continue to see people, starving, suffering, homeless, without medical care, without the needs that, without getting their needs met, not because we don't have the technology and the stuff to do it, but because of these questions of ownership, of questions of distribution, of questions of who owns those productive forces and who has access to them under a market system. And so there's this discrepancy between the way the world could be and the way the world is under capitalism. And that discrepancy, I would say, has only grown more so in our time. So what I try to kind of do in the essay is start by summarizing some of these key concepts from Benjamin-Adorno and these readings, and then apply those opposing ideas to a historical analysis of the popular music and the music industry. And so this chart here is one that I screenshotted from the essay itself. And it basically, just is a table that maps out like the rest of the argument, the rest of the paper, in the rest of the essay, in terms of these three dimensions that of popular music, capital and technology, of the production of music, and resistance and social struggles over music. So again, I'm trying to, in this essay, get at how the history of popular music has had this continuing push and pull, this continuing contradiction between, the centralizing and standardizing forces of the culture industry on the one hand, and the democratizing consequences of technological reproducibility on the other hand. And so if we look at the history of music, we see this ongoing contradiction, this ongoing conflict between these things. So in terms of capital and technology in the recording industry, the essay, maps out, this whole history of how the music industry came to be dominated by a handful of corporations, in Adorno's time. Then there was this moment, though, after World War II and into the 1950s, in which there was a kind of a decentralization, especially a decentralization of radio broadcasting. And what that allowed was, rock and roll music and rhythm and blues to get played on the radio and, sort of develop a mass following, especially of young people. And these were recordings that were predominantly on independent labels as opposed to, the major corporate labels. So there was this like opening up period there, especially around in the 1950s, a period of decentralization. But then, in the 1960s and 70s, music industry began to sort of re-centralize and began to, discover, all kinds of new ways to basically make money on young people and rock music and what was then known as the counterculture. So to some extent, like there was this, confluence between industry and capital in the music industry, so that vinyl records or compact discs were forms of recording technology that allowed these corporations to get hugely rich by selling recorded music, particularly to young people. But there's also been this like historical, tension, conflict, and that has sometimes erupted into an outright conflict between technology and the profits of the industry, and that has to do with like the threat of piracy and the way that these technologies of reproduction allow music and other kinds of culture to be reproduced and shared and spread in ways that is like kind of threatening to the interests of the industry and especially like companies that are trying to sell recorded music. And so this, especially erupted into the controversy around Napster and file sharing in the late 90s and early 2000s. But it has all kinds of predecessors that I talk about that go back, even back into the 70s and 80s, with controversies around like, taping, like people would be like, just taping an album, recording it and then giving the tape, to their friends, or making a mixtape or whatever. And like the, record industry felt compelled to put out this whole like, advertising campaign of kind of like how this was eating into their profits, because, if people could just tape their friend's album, then they weren't buying the album themselves. There's also the story in this essay about the squashing of digital audio tape technology, a way in which this really threatened the recording industry, because the possibility that people could like record like their CDs onto digital audio and then give it to their friends or neighbors or whatever. The the next section of that essay is about the production of music. And again, it's kind of sort of the interplay of what technology has made possible and what the industry has deemed profitable. So in the 1960s is a real kind of watershed moment here, where, rock musicians, like I quote a letter that the record company for the Grateful Dead sent to them. It was this really hostile kind of letter about like this, recording is just terrible. So initially there was this conflict between like rock musicians like the Grateful Dead and the so-called counterculture of the 1960s, because they were challenging the standardization of the music industry. The music industry didn't want them to be, quite so loud or have such long songs or have so many drug references and so forth. So there was this initial period of conflict, but then in time, the music industry, like I said in the previous slide, really began to learn to capitalize, to absorb this counterculture and this rock music revolution in the 60s and 70s, to create a more kind of open system in which they could, kind of absorb the culture and absorb the music rather than try and dictate it from top down. After the 1960s and 70s, though, you have a new wave of conflicts that happen within punk and hip hop and indie rock, where you have like subcultures and local scenes of musicians who are trying to democratize participation in music scenes through, in punk, it's called a DIY ethic. In hip hop, technologies like sampling enable people to be both, kind of like DJs, to be both like kind of producers and consumers of music at the same time. So this opens up a whole kind of new possibility for democratizing music making and participation in these local scenes during this time. And that sets off a kind of a new set of struggles and a new kind of forms of conflict and resistance over music. In terms of punk and indie rock, those many of those artists and musicians had sought a kind of creative independence from the corporate music industry in the name of authenticity and creative control. Bands like Fugazi in Washington D.C. really kind of like led this kind of crusade against the major labels and against the corporate, music industry and kind of like the culture industry at large. And, to some extent, this kind of rehashed some long-standing debates that go back to the 19th century about the conflict between art and commerce, and about, the question of to what extent like commercialism corrupts art and corrupts its authenticity or its purity of expression. Those kinds of debates, that started off kind of in the art world, maybe during the 19th century, kind of got then transposed in the 20th century into especially like the punk and indie rock world, in terms of debates about like selling out and, if bands went onto major labels, it was considered to be like a corruption of their artistic purity, or a corruption of their, in some cases, of their political relevance. So also, since like the 1970s, 80s, the techniques of like sampling and things that, started in DJ culture, as I mentioned in the previous slide, have also opened up a whole new set of like conflicts between, in terms of like technology versus and industry. So the practices by DJs in terms of sampling and remixing and, mashups, have in some cases challenged private ownership and copyright. So there was this kind of this golden age in hip hop in the, like in the late 1980s, where, you could take, you could kind of like sample from anybody, like you could sample like, the Beatles or the Eagles or Led Zeppelin, huge commercial artists were sampled in some of like, the Beastie Boys recordings, or in, by Public Enemy. And then in 1991, there's this copyright lawsuit that basically puts an end to all that. And so now, DJs have to try, either to find really obscure stuff that isn't copyrighted, or, have to kind of jettison, sampling altogether. But in, the last, I guess it's been 20 years or so, there have been new kind of conflicts that have arisen around copyright issues. One of my favorite being, this the Gray album by Danger Mouse that, you know, kind of mashed up the Beatles' White Album with Jay-Z's Black Album, with what I think is an eminently listenable mix, really good mashup that is somehow kind of different than the sum product of the two things that it combines. Girl Talk is another kind of mashup DJ that has challenged copyright in doing similar kinds of things, of like mashing up super popular music that's very obviously copyrighted, and just seeing, you know, and putting it out for free and seeing like what happens. So these questions, I'm sure I'm not exactly up to date on all of these developments in popular music, but this is my way of suggesting that I think that these are with us and here to stay. And I look forward to hearing from some of those of you who are younger about things that might be going on with regard to these questions now. Okay, that is pretty much our video lecture for the day, and I'll see you next time.